Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today I'm continuing my coverage for the Tribeca Film Festival with the documentary New Wave. So briefly, New Wave, directed by Elizabeth Ai, explores the Vietnamese New Wave music scene. What starts off as a music documentary turns into something intensely personal. The film took around 4 years to make and interviews a number of legends from the New Wave music industry. New Wave music is basically an umbrella term to describe European disco music that became very popular amongst young Vietnamese post-Vietnam War. The genre was then adopted by Vietnamese artists who really liked this sound. Like, it has a very upbeat, futuristic sound, and they used this sound to cover a number of popular tracks that became hugely popular in the Vietnamese community. And these tracks became a safe haven for a new generation that really had no template in terms of what it means to be Vietnamese American. The music essentially became a form of escapism. Like, it allowed them to get away from their problems, find other people with similar problems. And one artist describes the scene as, like, the music as very innocent and the scene as very chaotic and very dangerous. And what New Wave music allowed is this space for young people to kind of unleash all their frustrations because they really didn't have anyone to talk to about anything. There was such a discrepancy between first generation Vietnamese Americans and their parents. The only way that they could see other Vietnamese people is through these kind of variety shows. But the whole thing was very sad and very nostalgic, just praying for the motherland. And New Wave music, in contrast, was very optimistic. It was upbeat. Like, it gave young people some hope. The documentary utilizes a number of archival clips as well as personal home videos to really contextualize why this music was so important. Aesthetically, the film is very pleasing. It takes you back to a certain era. I like the way the movie mixed reenactments with archival clips with personal family videos. Like, it can feel like there's a lot going on in this documentary, but it always feels very cohesive. So it starts off kind of like with this wide view, giving us an introduction to New Wave and who the key artists were before really narrowing it down to a more personal story, and this story being that of our director. New Wave becomes like an access point for Elizabeth to really explore, okay, why was this music so important? What were they escaping from that was so difficult? And the more we listen to these stories, we realize they're very similar. A lot of them have shared the same trauma. And again, the space was really important because it just enabled them to survive a very difficult time period. After the Vietnam War, America accepted a number of refugees from Vietnam, and they kind of went from one war zone to another. Like, you survived a war, and now you have to figure out how you're going to start over. Everything you have has been taken away from you, and so they're in survival mode. They have to figure out how they're going to make money, how they're going to take care of their kids, and how are they going to help everyone else escape, because there is survivor's guilt where you just want to help as many people as you can, and sometimes that came at the expense of their children. Elizabeth describes being raised by her aunt, who was also a teenager, and Elizabeth's parents, as well as many from her generation, had intense PTSD, and because they're in survival mode, they didn't really have the capacity to love their children in the way that they desperately wanted, because again, they were too busy trying to figure out how to make it in America. The generational gap is huge because culturally, language-wise, like, it was like being of two different worlds. And again, because they arrived in America as refugees, they didn't really have time to raise their children in the way that they would have if they were, say, in Vietnam. And so a lot of it just became about adapting, assimilating, and trying to become successful. I felt that Elizabeth took a huge risk in using her own personal story as an example to show audiences what generational trauma actually looks like. The documentary introduces us to members of her family who open up about having escaped the war and kind of their own trauma and trying to not only raise Elizabeth, but just trying to navigate an environment where they were unfamiliar with the culture, unfamiliar with the language. And this is the first time that they were discussing these topics. Some of the conversations that are included in the documentary feel so personal. You almost feel like you shouldn't be listening in, like you should be turning away. The effort that Elizabeth puts in to try to get her family to really talk about their trauma, talk about what they went through, it's an enormous push right? Like it was not easy because they really didn't want to talk about it. There's that attitude kind of like, let sleeping dogs lie, like what's done is done. By the end of the documentary, you do feel like there's a sense of relief because what New Wave music did is it offered a space for young people to unleash these frustrations. And so this documentary basically was a space for her to finally like let everything out. And in order to overcome your past, you have to confront it. And sometimes the people you need to help you out with that, they don't want any part of it. Right. And I think what I appreciate about this documentary is that it doesn't demonize anyone, and it's very careful and always contextualizing why someone was behaving in the way that they were. And I think what that does is that it allows us as the audience to really put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And a great line in the documentary that sometimes like assumptions can become our truth. And it's very easy for us, I know it's very difficult, but to demonize the people we love, especially if they've hurt us. But depending on the situation, you oftentimes you realize it's because they've been hurt or similar things have happened to them. And I'm not saying it excuses their behavior, but it helps us to understand in order to let go. And I think sometimes in an effort not to repeat our past, we can end up actually just like overcompensating and doing the same thing. These feelings of resentment and frustration, they do manifest. And you can unknowingly carry that trauma on to your child or to other loved ones around you. Again, this is a very personal documentary. There are moments where you feel like you actually shouldn't be listening in. Overall, I highly recommend this documentary. It had me thinking about my own family and the stories that I've created around them. And I think what I appreciated about this documentary is that there's no end goal. You know, she's not looking for this grand apology or this grand reunion. It's just by speaking about it and getting it out in the open, we can start to confront these feelings that we've been harboring for so long. And just the act of talking about things that we buried for so long, because when we kind of hold things in, especially around, you know, the people we love and the people that we feel have done us dirty, we can actually just end up creating stories around it and demonizing them to the point where the only person we're hurting is ourselves, because we just end up harboring all this hate and this frustration about this person that probably has their own trauma to deal with. And I think the lesson of this documentary is always to have empathy. Again, it's not to excuse bad behavior, but in understanding someone, you can create that sense of empathy, not just for them, but for yourself, to give yourself that grace that, you know, none of us are perfect. If we can at least like understand one another, we can avoid repeating the same mistakes. So you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.